I thought I would share some pointers towards on this theme of looking at Malaysia where it is now, some of our challenges and struggles, but at the same time moving on from that point. I would like to make 5 key points in my presentation. It's a verbal one to reflect and note this. But I thought it would be appropriate to start with a personal note from my own family experience. When my wife and I were deciding to get married, we had to wait something like almost 10 years to get parental consent on both sides. We were studying, and I was in India, she was here, but after time we got the approvals of both parents. A village in Sitiawan called Kampong Ko. She's from a Fuchao Chinese community. We had some objections on both sides, but overall there was blessings and we waited for that. But one of our uncles refused to talk to her. And he said, nothing doing, you can't marry an Indian, Indian cannot be trusted, he will cheat you or he will ditch you, he will do all kinds of things to you. So he refused to talk to her or come for the wedding or be associated with us. But after time, we managed to befriend him and he used to meet up with him. But many, many years later, he called my wife Rose and said, Rose, I need your help, desperate help, because my daughter now wants to marry somebody, and he came and saw us. He said, Indian is okay now. Marrying Indian is okay, not so bad now. But my daughter doesn't want to marry Indian or Chinese. She wants to marry somebody from Africa. So African cannot, Indian is all right. So what we found that day in discussing with him was that he went through stages of change in his own racial profiling. And he started off Indian cannot, but eventually Indian is not too bad, but African cannot at all, But eventually the couple, husband and wife, accepted the daughter with the African husband, especially when the son came. The son is a lovely young boy, and it's an amazing story. So we see that racism or prejudices or things that are way we look at someone else is part of a whole social conditioning process. And this would be my first point, that it is not specific to any one particular community or group. You can't pinpoint and say, this community is actually racist and the other is not. Because within every community, there would be people who find it difficult to accept someone that is different, someone or the other person. It could be color, it could be religion, it could be gender, it could be sexual preferences, it could be something else. It could be from another continent. It could be someone who dresses differently. So people always have that kind of a phobia. When I walk on the street, sometimes I see a lady walking opposite, and she would suddenly walk across the road, Although I might, I'm not a dangerous person, but she would do it. Because people fear people with beards, because they think, this guy is, up to some mischief and things like that. Or with beards, you get confused, In northern India, they would always assume I'm a Muslim. In England, they would assume I'm a Muslim. But in other parts, it's not. So the other, the picturing the other, it's a form of social conditioning, the upbringing, the sense of fear. And often families, right from childhood, would say, oh, this, the policeman will come and catch you if you don't eat your food, or that Indian man will catch you, and things like that. Each family creates a demon out of something, sometimes harmlessly, sometimes culturally bound, sometimes mischievously, but it becomes part of the psychic that then becomes difficult to wipe out. And all of us have it at some point. So we can't just pinpoint and say, this race is more racist than the other, my race is all right, is the sort. So we need to have a check at the personal, individual level at this point. So the notion of the other and the notion of someone who is different. Now, in approaching racism and inter-ethnic relations, much of the discourse in Malaysia takes the framework, which is a conflict type. It's polarities, it's conflict. We are always looking at the negativities of the story. We are always looking at the worst case scenario. We jump into quick conclusions. It's always built on everything is bad, previously was so great, and things of that sort. You know, if it was so great, why did May 13 take place? You know? So the sort of analysis comes from conflict. You know? So people would always look at certain communities, like the story did, using a framework that is of conflict. Others from the Institute of Ethnic Studies, and tomorrow when you meet Professor Samsul, he framed what is called social cohesion. And he uses a different yardstick to see that societies are able to coexist, and there must be some synergies that keep them together. There are difficulties, there are struggles, like in a family, in a relationship, but we need to look at the conflict points, the challenging points, but on the whole, human beings want to live in peace with each other. So cohesion and the challenges to that. So we need to look at, in analyzing and breaking up this theme, what sort of framework and approach we want to use. But we must recognize the two levels in which one is our experiential level, the individual and family, and the other which is the institutional. Sometimes it is institutional, there are laws, there are systems, there are things operating that brings out very clearly that there are real racist policies and elements. And other times it is at a personal, individual level. The state might not be part of it, but in other times it's institutionalized. And history, whether it's the apartheid, whether it is the Nazi movement in the way they promoted superiority of race over the Jewish community and against blacks and other colored communities, is a systematic institutional approach. So we need to have this in mind, which as a starting point to recognize these pointers. And in my general opening, it's also that it's a global phenomena and it's still an issue all over the world, whether it's on issues of religion, about sub-ethnicity, it can be as a result of class, where people are being discriminated and marginalized in some sense. My second main point is that in recent times in Malaysia, there is this euphoria and popularization of one Malaysia. So what is Malaysia, one Malaysia? What is this? What are the themes related to it? Some are skeptical, some say this is just a BN political rhetoric, there is nothing to it. I've heard the PM speech on a number of occasions. I've heard others trying to expound it. I've always taken public policies to be very good and constructive. It's how then do we unpack a public policy, give substance and depth towards it, and use it as an indicator of monitoring. So if the PM's theme of One Malaysia is moving beyond tolerance to acceptance, and beyond acceptance to celebrating and appreciating differences, the diversity is welcome, the difference is beautiful, it enriches Malaysia. That's the public political discourse. Now that discourse is being undermined every day by people within government, within the mainstream political sector, by others, from this fundamental issue of moving beyond tolerance to acceptance. So we need to unpack what does acceptance mean and what does appreciation mean, it becomes quite critical. This week, I went with a few people to Kelantan, to University Kelantan, Malaysia, to look at the phenomena of women entrepreneurs of Kelantan and how they are motivated in a struggling economy to build. And it's amazing because for some of us outside of the East Coast, we sometimes have very negative views that it's too Islamic, it's too traditional, it's too fundamental. But to go down, to speak to ordinary people, to sit down with them and discuss various things, you begin to open up. And so understanding and appreciation requires a certain amount of openness and confidence in oneself, in one's own identity, and moving on. So I think we need to use those cliches and use it as a benchmark to assessing government practice, political rhetoric, and actions of politicians. Do they match up to the rhetoric that they are speaking of? Or is it just a slogan? You know, because sometimes it becomes very embarrassing, you know. You got one toilet, you got one this, everything is one. So it becomes a problem. But in substance and essence, the One Malaysia, moving beyond tolerance to understanding and acceptance, and beyond that to appreciation, I think it's a fantastic concept. We need to use it and hold politicians accountable, hold the state accountable to a public policy that has been so popularized in the country, and do a critique of it. That's my second point. The third point that I think today and tomorrow you must struggle. I know it is sensitive, it can be seditious, it can be all kinds of things that people say about it, and that you must struggle with Article 153. Edmund is here with his constitution and other things. He says he's a lawyer bureau, but actually he's an actual lawyer. People like me are the lawyer bureau, because I also brought my constitution today. Because I would think Article 153, in the spirit of the federal constitution and the way it is written, is actually acceptable. There isn't a problem with it. So what then becomes the problem? So in Article 153, we read of the provision in which that on the one hand, there is the safeguarding of the special position of the Malays and natives of the states of Sabah and Sarawak, and the legitimate interest of other communities. Very often in Article 153, the special position is almost literally defended to a point in which people are willing to die for it. But they fail to realize in the very stroke of the pen, the phrase legitimate interest of other communities is also listed. There's very little unpacking of what is the constitutional guarantee of the legitimate interest of other communities. Because the federal constitution in many ways is a balancing document. It's a document worked by the people. It's a compromise of some kind. It's bringing together communities or nations within a nation. And it's then expounded in that way. And if we take the provisions that are made, either for reservation in public jobs or businesses or scholarships, I don't think most people would have a principal problem with the legal points or even the policy framework of the new economic policy and the subsequent policies that have come. So where is the problem? I think the problem lies in the sort of interpretation. If we then take special position to then mean superiority of one race over another, that is not a constitutional provision. Superiority of race does not come into account because equality of citizenship right comes. So with the stroke of the pen, those of us, like my grandfather who came in 1910, my grandfather came to a small town. It's a dangerous town now, Batu Laut, near Morib, where recent murders took place. around that area in Banting, and he lived all his life. He never went further than Batu Laut, Banting, Klang. And this was 100 years ago. And within those communities, I still possess my grandmother's citizenship certificate, because my father filed it and kept it, and we found it after my dad's death in one of his files, that they applied, they were serious about their citizenship rights. There was equality of citizenship, but there's a provision in 153 for a number of reasons. And that is something we need to discuss, whether those reasons are justified today, how should it be interpreted, how then should it be enhanced over a period of time, because there is equality, but there is also a provision. So special position doesn't mean superiority of one race over another. So many different words are used, tuan, this and that. We sometimes call the policeman tuan and all that, but it's not meant to be superior, because in Islam, in other religions, it's not possible to have superiority of race, because from an Islamic perspective or someone from a theocentric perspective, there is a creator, and all of us are equal, not only before God, but before law, before the courts. And so the problem then is the abuse and the politicization of these concepts that become a problem. And so in the course of the discussion, we need to unpack it in that way. Fourthly, I would feel the convention, Tan Sri Azmi just now made reference to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Dr. Ong led a team to do a study and review for the Department of National Unity on it, and at some point she could highlight the findings of that study. But I think if Malaysia is committed to one Malaysia, if we parade ourselves as truly Asia, then we should have been the first country to have actually ratified the convention. In a sense, it's a mockery for government today for not ratifying it. Now, the fear of not ratifying it is largely because of Article 153. And many of us feel that convention makes a provision for positive discrimination. Indian Constitution protects certain sections of its community using positive discrimination. America has positive discrimination, but it's always for the poor, the disadvantaged, the marginalized. And that point is something we need. So I would feel ratifying the convention is not inconsistent with Article 153 and the provisions, but the abuses of the NEP, abuses in misinterpreting 153, I'm a lawyer buruk speaking here, is the problem. It's the real problem. And unfortunately, you and I cannot really openly talk about it, but young people here, like my daughters, constantly challenge these sort of things because they are neither Indian nor Chinese. They say they are truly Malaysian. They don't look Indian, they don't speak Tamil, they don't speak Mandarin, they only speak Bahasa and they speak English. And they feel they are truly Malaysian, so they want it reinterpreted. So the convention. And fifthly and finally, the problem related to politics and race is something we need to look at. And what is important in the course of this discussion is two things. One is I think we need some amount of openness. You have people on the right and on the left, very few trying to mediate or the moderates who are consistent in this area. But I think it's important to be open, to be frank. It is not undermining people, because I've seen racial slurs from all communities coming out. So I think it's important, openness and frankness. And secondly, I think we need to find, I worked many years in very racial-oriented focus, although in a dichotomized way, but it's important for us to use other indicators that can find commonalities. That means the poor, whether you are Indian, whether you're Malay, whether you're Orang Asli, whether you are Iban, Kadasan, are being marginalized by the rich, powerful. And how do we find now new synergies of working across race and religion that really brings community empowerment and change? How would we use new indicators to popularize politics and policy? How would we move away from racial politics? So I think in one slant, it's largely because of politics that many of these things are becoming worse and in a worse scenario today. Those are some of my thoughts, but I'm very confident that as we move along and as I see the cross-section, I was commenting, seeing the cross-section today in this hall is, I think, not only something praiseworthy, but it's indicative of the changes that are coming and changes that are possible as people who want to see the true Malaysia, one Malaysia emerge. Thank you very much.